Dr. Wen, you've referred to Omicron recently several times as less severe, but there's a disturbing trend among pediatric hospitalizations and some concern that small children might be badly affected by this virus, which seems to affect the upper airways. What's your thinking on this? Do we know the science yet? Should parents of particularly young children be concerned at this point?
Well, I am such a parent. I've got two children under the age of 5. I have a 4-year-old who doesn't turn 5 until August and a 21-month-old who was a pandemic baby and has not known anything other than the pandemic times that we're living in. And so I very eagerly await the moment when my two little kids can become vaccinated because our realities compared to so many other families is that it hasn't really changed much for us. I mean, I'm so glad that children 5 and older are able to be vaccinated. I've seen so many families return to their pre-pandemic normals as a result, but families like mine are still waiting for that reassurance. Look, I think part of the reality with Omicron is that we believe it is much milder for adults, in particular those who are vaccinated. There is no evidence that in younger children, including children under 5, that it's more severe. We are probably seeing an uptick in hospitalizations in this group, mainly because the overall level of virus in our communities is so high. We're seeing skyrocketing numbers of COVID cases, and those are only the cases that are reported. At home antigen tests are not being reported for the most part, and also many people are just unable to get tests and so don't know that they have COVID and are not being counted in the official numbers. When you have a very large number of people infected, even if it's a milder variant, you end up having a lot of people getting sicker just by the pure numbers. But that said, I think another part of the risk calculus for families like mine with younger children is it's become so much harder to avoid Omicron. The activities that we thought were relatively safer before now all carry much more risk because of how contagious Omicron is and also how many people around us probably are infected but just may not necessarily know it and are spreading it to others. And so the price that we would have to pay to avoid Omicron is even higher than before. And many families are having the conversation, as my family and I have had, to say, look, we of course don't want to get infected. But that said, we don't want to keep our 4-year-old out of school. And for how long? That's the other part of this is we don't know when the next variant is going to come. I agree with Dr. Adams. This is not the end of the pandemic. We could actually have Omicron or another version of Omicron in 3 months' time, in 6 months, in 12 months. Are we going to keep on shutting down society, closing our schools, tanking our economy every time? I think not. And I think it's time for us to embrace that there has to be a practical middle ground where we don't shut everything down, but we are saying wear a high quality mask when you're indoors. Well, we're not saying don't let people go to restaurants or other high risk settings, but rather can we mandate vaccinations in those settings? I think it's time for us to reset our expectations and really learn to live with the virus while also hoping that everyone can become vaccinated, including our under 5-year-olds.
And key
So,
point for your viewers really quickly, this because this is key. When you look at the kids who are being hospitalized right now with COVID, two things really stick out to doctors like myself and Dr. Wen. Number one, they're unvaccinated, the majority of them. Number two risk factor is that they're coming from families where people around them are unvaccinated. So Dr. Wen mentioned her kids not eligible for vaccination, but she's doing all she can by making sure she and everyone who they encounter are vaccinated and providing this protective cocoon for these kids when they're in a home environment or an environment which she can control. So the number one thing your viewers, your listeners, your readers can do to protect kids and their ability to safely go to school is to get people vaccinated if they're eligible, and for people who aren't eligible, to make sure that everyone around them who can get vaccinated is actually vaccinated. That is just so incredibly important, and we need to keep hammering that point home to people. That's how we safely reopen schools and keep our kids out of trouble. And the other point, Dr. Wayne, we talked about science. She mentioned the math. Omicron has shown itself to be about a third as likely to send people to the hospital as Delta variant, 1/3. But it's shown itself to be 4 to 5 times more contagious. So on an individual level, if you've got to pick between Omicron and Delta, you want Omicron, and it's going to be much less likely to send you to the hospital. But on a population level, we're still seeing hospitals being overwhelmed because 1/3 is likely times 4 times as many people getting it means you still have about a 1.3, a significantly increased chance of people on a population level ending up in the hospital. And instead of looking at broad cases, one of the things we need to look at when we talk about reopening schools, reopening other places, and relaxing other measures is our hospital capacity. We're back to the point where in many communities we do need to flatten the curve because we've canceled elective cases. We're not doing things from a screening perspective that we could and should be doing for other people out there. And so that's where that push and that pull between reopening, but also making sure we're preserving our emergency response capacity is going to play out in the next 6 months, or really in the next 6 weeks, quite frankly, in communities across the country.